Good morning and welcome to the All Energy Decarbonise webinar series. I am Peter Bloor, the Event Director for All Energy, and I would like to start proceedings by thanking everyone who has joined us today for this session on floating offshore wind, breaking out into deeper waters and new territories. Floating offshore wind is posed for rapid growth acceleration. The latest summary findings from the Floating Wind Joint Industry project from the Carbon Trust reported that 70 gigawatts could be installed globally by 2040. Our panel will provide an update on floating offshore wind both here in the UK and around the globe, showcasing efforts to bring down the cost, standardise our delivery model, and grow out stable markets that support these longer-term ambitions to go deeper. Prior to the session, I would like to provide some housekeeping notes. So I encourage everyone in the audience to interact with our speakers as much as possible. You can do that via voting in the polls and asking live questions. If you're watching the session in full screen mode, you will need to minimize your screen to vote in the polls and provide feedback. Feedback is provided by the Rate This Session tab below. Insert your comments alongside your rating. Now, with over 500 registrations for this session alone, we have achieved over 7,500 registrations throughout our All Energy Decarbonise webinar series thus far, which is tremendous support from the industry. So thank you to everyone for your ongoing support. We also have 2 additional sessions tomorrow, so please check out our content that we have lined up on our Bright Talk webinar channel and register as soon as possible if you wish to join us. Before handing over to our chair, Matt Smith, who is the founding director at Lumen Energy and Environment and former deputy CEO of Renewable UK, I must congratulate Matt as he has recently been appointed as the Vice Chair of the Global Wind Energy Council's Floating Offshore Wind Task Force. Thank you also to our 4 speakers in this session. We're extremely grateful that they are sharing their time and expertise with us today. I will now hand you over to Matt to start the session. So thank you for joining us. Enjoy the content, interact with our speakers, and we look forward to seeing many of you tomorrow as well. Thank you.
Peter, thank you very much. It's great to be here, and it's been great to take part in these All Energy seminars, and for us all as an industry to find a way to keep talking to each other. That's been really vital at this time. We're going to get back together soon, of course, but for now, great to have you all, great to have you in the audience, and if I can add my thanks, of course, to the panel. So we're going to be talking floating offshore wind. The theme of the webinar is breaking out into deeper waters, new territories. And I've been working on floating offshore wind for a number of years, looking at UK policy while I was at Renewable UK, looking at industry development. In my current role at Lumen, I'm working with clients on floating, including looking at Scotwind, working with an OEM called Seawind, looking at breaking into the UK market. And lots of people are talking about floating. And in this new task force that GWEC has set up, we're looking at the global market, and we're with Henrik Stiesdal, the chair, and the members of that task force. We're looking at, well, which markets are going first and which markets may need support, and how do we coordinate discussion and activity amongst those markets. So we're not trying to do things in isolation, but learn as we go and try and accelerate, if you will, what's happening in floating offshore wind. So we've got a lot to talk about. This acceleration, you know, for many people, floating isn't happening quicker than we had thought, if only a few years ago. Offshore wind as a whole is scaling, but floating is scaling too. The UN's Offshore Renewable Energy Action Coalition report recently showed 1.4 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050 can be delivered. That's a lot of offshore wind, and we need to get active around the globe in new markets, not just our traditional European markets, if we're going to get there. So there's lots for us to talk about. So without further ado, I'll introduce our panel. Then I'm going to open it up for an initial statement from each of them, and then we're going to go into questions and polls. So we're keen to hear your views as the audience. So do get involved, as Peter says, and let us know what you think. Respond to what people are saying, ask questions, respond to the polls we've created. So let's see where we go. So firstly, Alan McCaskill, Director of Kincardine Offshore Wind Farm. Second, Rodri James, Lead Business Developer for Equinor. Followed by Una Brosnan, the Business Strategy Development Manager for Atkins. And finally, last but not least, Ralph Torr, the Program Manager for the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult. So all, thank you for your time. And Alan, if I can hand over to you to give us your opening remarks.
Okay, well, pleased to meet you all, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoy the discussions that we're going to have today. I've been involved in floating offshore wind for a number of years. First of all, in my days in Sea Energy, when we started to work alongside EDP on their project in Portugal, and then more recently, I've been part of the Kincardine project, which we're starting to get back moving again. Hopefully, over the next few months, we will have everything starting to arrive at site. Cable goes in a coming week or so, and then the remainder of the project will start to progress. Been a bit delayed by COVID, but hopefully we will get there this year. That I think is very a brief upgrade. Obviously now involved in other companies looking particularly at floating because we have the experience from Kincardine, but also fixed because we see a transition occurring over the next decade to from fixed globally to floating, as the flexibility of floating and the ability to move into different work geographies creates huge opportunities for it. Anyway, I will pass back to Maf and he can then let the next person talk.
Alan, thank you for that. Rodri, next over to you for your opening thoughts and remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Good morning, everybody. I hope you're all safe and well, wherever you're joining us from, whether it be home or somewhere more exciting. My name is Rodri James. I'm a lead business developer at Equinor. We focus on identifying and maturing opportunities floating offshore wind in some key markets. And the UK is certainly one of those key markets where I'm focusing my efforts. I think it's fair to say that Equinor have been at the forefront of developing floating offshore wind. It's over the past couple of decades. And this really stems from our experience in oil and gas, where we are the world's largest operator of floating offshore energy assets. So there are capabilities and competences there where we have a very in-depth understanding of the technology, and we have the capability to deliver complex, large-scale projects in very harsh offshore environments, and we can do so safely. So this is experience we have taken with us to offshore wind, and particularly floating offshore wind. And that started back in 2001 when this was initially drawn up on paper. So it's nearly 2 decades that we've been looking at this technology and developing it. We installed the world's first floating offshore wind turbine in 2009 off the coast of Norway, and we followed that up in 2017 with Hywind Scotland, the world's first floating wind farm off the coast of Peterhead. And both these projects have proven the technology. They have proven that it is certainly technically feasible, and we've seen operational performance of over 95% availability from Hywind Scotland, resulting in capacity factors of about 56% on average since we started production. And those figures really demonstrate and highlight the business case for floating offshore wind in being able to access high wind speeds, produce high volumes of low carbon power. So for us now, with the technology proven, it's about proving cost reduction. Our next project is going to be Hywind Tampen. This will be at 88 megawatts. It'll be 3 times bigger than Hywind Scotland. And we hope to deliver and expect to deliver cost reduction of about 40% in doing so. So you'll be aware that this will not be a grid connected project, but we'll be powering some oil and gas platforms off the coast of Norway. So delivering quite significant CO2 reductions to our oil and gas production, whilst also further proving and maturing floating technology. That project we hope to have commissioned by 2022, and we're already looking at opportunities for the next phase of development, which will be larger projects again in the hundreds of megawatts of scale. We're progressing opportunities in Europe and East Asia in the range of 200 to 300 megawatts, which we hope to have installed by the middle of the next decade, mid-2020s. And we see opportunities to even reach gigawatt scale by that time frame in certain markets. And gigawatt scale is really what we are aiming for, and that's where the UK fits in our view. Looking towards the end of this decade when we will have projects, hopefully emerging from ScotWind and also from other leasing rounds in the UK, that'll be ready to make a quite significant contribution to the UK's decarbonisation efforts. With each step we're making, we are able to deliver quite significant cost reduction. So I mentioned the 40% reduction from Hywind Scotland to Hywind Tampen, and we expect to see similar levels of cost reduction in successive projects. So we are confident that if deployed at scale, I think scale is a key point to put across, that floating wind can be cost competitive within a decade. If we can get there, then floating can play a major role in decarbonising economies from 2030 and onwards. So I'm looking forward to getting into more details on that in the discussion and the Q&A, but I'll hand back to Matt.
Audrey, thank you for that. That's a great summary. And next, Una, can you give us your opening thoughts?
Yeah, good morning all. It's really good to be back, I suppose, out in industry again and talking to folk. It's an exciting time for industry. We're really on the cusp of developing commercial scale floating wind. And I mean, it's a great time for industry and supply chain to really take that step into industrializing our opportunity now, particularly here in the UK. We've had some challenging times with COVID, but I think it's actually offered us an opportunity to take stock and have a little bit of focus time and really see how we're going to grab this as a nation and really and pull this opportunity that's coming out of Scotland and realise it in the next decade, and then build on that to hit our 2040 targets. Commercialization doesn't come without its challenges. In particular, Atkins has been very passionate about offshore wind over the last decade. We've been very much at the forefront of driving innovation in fixed bottom, and I think there's a lot of learning that we can take across from the fixed bottom solutions and bring it across into, say, elements like standardization and looking at commercialization and working with supply chain and how we can realize this and drive local content within our supply chain in particular. I mean, we've worked really hard to get to the sector deal, and I think it's really within our gift as such to make sure that we can reap the benefits of the innovation and the hard work we've done to date when it comes to demonstrators in Scotland. It's fantastic. I mean, Ralph is on the call here. He's leading up the Centre of Excellence for Floating Wind, and we're delighted to have that here in Glasgow. I think that's a really positive step forward for industry and making sure that we are focusing on the right elements and driving our supply chain down the right investment routes, and particularly around the cost reduction side. So thank you. Looking forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you for that. And then you've already introduced Ralph. So Ralph, if I can just hand over to you to give us the final thoughts before we start on the polls and questions.
Yeah, thanks for that, Matt, and thanks to everybody for joining today. So a brief introduction to myself. So my name's Ralph Torr. I'm a program manager at the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult. As Una mentioned, I've been working with the team here since last year to establish the Floating Offshore Wind Centre of Excellence. It's a collaborative program led by the ORE Catapult, really aimed at accelerating the commercialisation of floating offshore wind, particularly here in the UK. I guess the very fact that the ORE Catapult, who's been working floating offshore wind since shortly after we were established, has taken the lead on establishing the Centre of Excellence. It's not something we do lightly, and I think it should be flagged that that's a recognition of the potential and the opportunity we see in floating offshore wind here in the UK. There's clearly two main benefits that we perceive floating offshore wind will have here for the UK. One is the role that it's going to play in the UK delivering on its net zero ambitions by 2050, but we also believe that it's got a really really good chance and high potential to deliver real elevated levels of economic activity here in the UK, and clearly that's never been more that's never been more in focus than in current circumstances. So yeah, the dual role there is to ensure that it can deliver its role in net zero, but also to make sure that it's a successful economic venture for the UK as well. We've got a very strong supply chain with a lot of skills very relevant to floating offshore wind, and we're really looking to try and ensure that they're able to grow and deliver into projects as we think they should be able to. The Centre of Excellence at the moment, the ambition is that this is a kind of broader collaborative model. So we've 10 industry partners appointed at the moment. We'll shortly be making some announcements about our academic and other relationships as well. But I think it's really important that we're taking that kind of rounded partnership view to establishing the Centre of Excellence, because there is very much going to require the engagement and direction and coordination amongst quite a diverse range of stakeholders to ensure that the UK can deliver on its ambitions for floating offshore wind. So yeah, very, very much looking forward to today's session. As Matt said, I would encourage you all to ask questions and to vote in the polls. And yeah, looking forward to engaging in dialogue with the other participants here. But yeah, I'll hand back to you now, Matt.
Great, thank you, Ralph. Thanks all. So we're going straight to a poll for you, and then while you're looking at the poll, we're going to start questions. So we've got 2 polls coming in rapid succession. First, we're interested in knowing about what your appetite, what your expectation for floating offshore wind. So thinking about the 40 gigawatt target that we now have in the UK for 2030. I'd like to get your views as the audience. What role do you think that floating offshore wind is going to play in delivering of that 40 gigawatts? And then after that, so you know what's going to happen next, we'll be asking you what's going to happen out to 2050. But first, we'll put the first poll up. What do you think floating will do by 2030? And while that's running through, you're giving us our answers. If I can come to the panel. So let's look at this 40 gigawatts. The Prime Minister himself set out this ambition, and at the same time, he made a commitment to growth of floating offshore wind, which was really great to see. We've got a government now consulting on a CFD. We've had the responses. They're mulling those over. We'll see later what they're going to do. And we've got, of course, got ScotWind looking at a number of sites, including deep water sites around Scottish waters. So based on the assumption that the CFD goes ahead, my question is, does this essentially mean the UK market is now all systems go? Or are there other things, other barriers in place that we would need to tackle first to really get floating going here in the UK? And Alan, if I could come to you first on that.
Okay, yeah, there's lots of barriers. It's a start of a journey if we're going to get there and we're going to deliver progress over the coming decades and then moving out towards achieving net zero by 2050. The clarity that there's a funding mechanism brings people into the game. And once you've got people in the game, then the technologies start to come out and they start to progress forward. But, you know, we've still got a long journey just because of the ScotWind sites, which will take time it'll be the middle of the decade probably before we can get them through to consent, and then you have to finance them, etc. So yes, I think there's a big opportunity to do something. I'm not quite sure what the ultimate scale will be. And I think I also agree with Rodri that the key challenge is ultimately how long and how quickly can we will it take us to get to the gigawatt projects. And the other big opportunity is, you know, we've done that with fixed, and how much of the lessons that we've learned in fixed can we apply and then therefore speed up the time it will take to move from fixed to floating. I spent most of my career in the oil business, and you know, you saw that transformation occur in that business in basically less than a decade. It was very quick. I went to Canada and everything was fixed. I came back to the North Sea and we were filling out a generation of fixed structures. But within 3 or 4 years before I went to Houston, everybody was looking at floating, and there was a remarkable transformation on that period of time. And it's the starting point for virtually everything now, unless you've got a very big field in a relatively shallow water things, or it's going to be a long-term hub. Anyway, I'll pass on and let somebody else make their comments and views.
Thanks, Alan. Una, what are your thoughts on barriers?
Yeah, to echo Alan's comments, yes, absolutely. We do have our challenges ahead in the next decade if we are going to realise commercial scale projects. But I mean, we have a number of demonstrators in the water. There's a lot of lessons there we can take, and we've got stepping stone projects such as the likes of Highwind Tampen, which, you know, you're looking at, I think it's 10, 11 units, which is a great opportunity for supply chain to get familiar and test its methods to scaling up to commercial scale, and I suppose instilling techniques around standardization. But yes, the opportunity is now, in particular for the supply chain, to really start focusing on how we can deliver. I mean, we are talking well, 2026, 2027, 2028 before we really start to get going on some of these projects. But we really now need to build the foundations to delivering these right now in the early 2020s. We've got a lot of challenges around infrastructure, making sure that we've got sufficient capacity to build these out, build the projects out in sufficient locations. I mentioned serial fabrication and commercialization of the substructures in particular. How we do this, how best we can do this in a method that will drive down cost is going to be key. And I suppose ramping up our workforces. We've got challenges in the oil and gas side, and this is a perfect opportunity for, I suppose, an industry to take stock and go, well, where can we diversify our skill sets? I mean, they have a wealth of knowledge and experience in the offshore environment. No other industry has better experience. So now is the opportunity to embrace that and work with the offshore renewable industry, you know, to actually realize the potential there and bring the lessons learned. I mean, there's a lot we can do and a lot still to be done around safety in particular, and especially with quite dynamic structures which are floating. G Plus has reported, you know, there has been a lot of positive steps forward, but I mean, going in the safety side, but we need to do a lot more work there. So I think bringing in diversified industries in and working cross sector is going to be key, particularly if you are looking as well at fabrication side and looking to the shipbuilding side. I mean, getting those relationships now in place and thinking about how we can maximize our potential here is going to be key.
Great, thanks, Una. Okay, let's see what people are saying about how much floating wind by 2030 here in the UK. So very little, so less than a gigawatt. People are saying that 9% of people think that's where we'll be. The majority, 59%, those say will be quite a bit, up to 5 gigawatts. 25% of you think there could be somewhere between 5 and 10 gigawatts, and 5% think we're going to have over 10 gigawatts by 2030. So, you know, sort of quite a spread. Some quite ambitious people amongst you. That's great. Most people looking at 5 gigawatts. Just before, I'm going to ask the panelists to respond to that, but highlight the Carbon Trust report, the latest Audit report. Some of you may have seen came out yesterday. It was saying they expect 10.7 gigawatts of floating by 2030, and that's a global figure. So many of you are saying you expect the UK to be potentially delivering half of that global figure. So there's a lot of ambition out there on the web today. Rodri, and you did obviously coordinate some of those Audit pieces of work. What's your view about how much floating we could expect to see?
Yeah, I think we've got quite an intelligent audience, I'd say. So I would agree with the up to 5 gigawatts being likely. I think one thing to remember, I certainly like to see the ambition of some of the higher numbers, but we first need to have consented projects, and that is the first barrier, is getting projects leased, getting acreage and gigawatt scale sites available that are then eligible for CFD rounds. ScotWind is a really exciting development that's kicking off as we speak, and that will be the platform for the first projects coming through. Then once we have the lease in place, the consents will be hugely important, and it will take, you know, you're looking at a minimum of 4 years to get projects consented and ready for CFD. So getting high volumes in by 2030 will be a challenge simply because of time frame. But I'm certainly confident that we can have hopefully a few gigawatts installed. That does mean that we're going to need, once we have consented sites, have the support mechanism in place. I think it's really encouraging that BEI's in the consultation, they're looking at separating floating from bottom fixed offshore wind. But I think the devil really is going to be in the detail of that. I think the pot 2 that's there is a mix of lots of different technologies, different price levels. And the key thing will be the budget and the allocation of treasury funds to support projects in pot 2. So from our perspective, as I've mentioned, we really feel that we need to go to larger scale projects. We believe we're ready to do so, the technology is ready, but we need the policy mechanisms and the frameworks that then allow us to build those sorts of projects. So I think the certainly more than a gigawatt, but unlikely to get more than 5 gigawatts is where I put it. But I would like us to be ambitious and find ways that we can get projects consented quickly, obviously doing it responsibly and sustainably, but having projects ready for the CFD auctions as soon as possible so that we can get those commissioned by the end of the decade.
Thanks, Rodri. And Ralph, what sort of numbers are you working with when your discussions with your members in your Centre of Excellence?
Yeah, so I mean, I would support the majority in terms of the view that it will be more than one, but less than 5. I would just really highlight, I think the next 10 years are going to be absolutely pivotal for floating offshore wind here in the UK. I think if we are able to work collaboratively and enact the policy levers that we require and get the sites leased and developed and can be up towards the top end of that 5 gigawatts, where we'll be in a really strong position to grow a very large and successful industry. If we're down towards the bottom end of that, down towards the kind of single gigawatt or even below that, then then we have further work to do. I think that the next 10 years will really define the kind of rate of growth of the industry here in the UK. And when you project that out to 2040 and to 2050, the difference between delivering a gigawatt by 2030 and 5 gigawatts is very significant. So yeah, just really keen that all the different stakeholders really focus in the coming years to put those foundational policies and infrastructure investment discussions and project teams in place to make sure that we can really try and be as close towards the top of that figure as possible.
Great, thanks, Ralph. So let's go back out and let's get the second poll live. So we've got your views on 2050. That's really good. But let's now look out to 2050. I said at the start that globally we're looking at 1.4 terawatts of offshore wind, and in a lot of those markets around the world, that's going to mean a very large role for floating offshore wind. But to just come back to the UK, the Committee on Climate Change says that if we're going to hit out those net zero targets, we're going to need at least 75 gigawatts of offshore wind. So how much of that do you think could be floating? So the options we've got for you are up to 10, up to 20, up to 30, or 30 plus, all gigawatts, of course. So you let us know your thoughts on that. And while we do, let's go and look at leasing. So we've already had mention of the ScotWind leasing program, and of course we're in the midst of a leasing round in the outside of Scotland run by the Crown Estate. So those processes are live. We're expecting new entrants coming in the market. A lot of people are looking at both those leasing courses, and for the floating, of course, Scotland is really interesting, but there's going to be new sites, new developments outside of Scotland too in the future. So as we push into deep waters in Scotland, outside of Scotland, what would you like to see? And I'm particularly interested in people's views about what you'd like to see from the Crown Estate in terms of should it be emulating some things that Crown Estate Scotland are doing? And if we're to deliver the 75 gigawatts by 2050, then realistically, how soon do we need a further set of auctions? So Una, can I ask you to start on that?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I mean, it's an exciting time with auctions live at the minute, but I mean, we need to keep the eye on the ball, particularly around the next steps and what we're going to do there. I mean, for me, it's imperative that the next round of leases are maintained and we keep the momentum on getting the projects out there to site to get them in the project pipeline as such. I mean, we've got round 4, which is hopefully closing out in October this year, and it's hopefully the Crown Estate will be then looking at the next steps and putting in place why we need to prepare for that next round. The Celtic Sea is one which might drum up some interest, particularly around the floating side, and it's a great opportunity. I mean, we're seeing Ireland really excel with its ambitions around fixed and floating. So, there is a lot of opportunity, I think, to be explored there for the next round as such. In Scotland, again, yes, we're a little bit later next year with confirmation around the sites, but again, ensuring that we have that pipeline in Scotland in particular is key. I suppose one of the big lessons learned we had from Fixed Bottom was around the supply chain, making sure that we had visibility and confidence behind the pipeline that we had in place, and making sure that we have commitments from governments in particular. And that CFD is going to be pivotal to make sure that we can keep confidence in the market from an investment perspective and keep that portfolio going. Because, I mean, for our ports and harbours and investing in our supply chain, that is going to be pivotal, particularly in some challenging economic times at the minute. We really, really need to commit to this and follow through on what we're going to do and what we're going to realize over the next decade to ensure that we're bringing along the supply chain, not just the project pipeline.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, and Ralph, your thoughts as well. I mean, what would you like to see to help bring this pipeline forward?
it's really important that we work hard in the short term to try and identify, what the project activity is between, Hywind Scotland and Kincardine and these very large projects coming through. That kind of mid-scale of project of a couple of 100 megawatts, I think, is going to be really important in helping build the supply chain capability, building knowledge within the sector about how to deliver these projects, be really important to build confidence in government about the ability for larger projects to deliver sizable cost reduction. So I think one of the short-term priorities is about how do we enable those mid-scale projects of a couple of 100 megawatts here in the UK, because I think there's real benefit for the government, but also supply chain and industry in facilitating those. Given the kind of time of the essence nature of net zero, I think it's also important that kind of mid-scale project activity, is each of those plays some sort of coordinated role in helping the industry move forward. They will, albeit not demonstrator scale, they will still have some element of demonstration about them. And I think it's important to view them as a portfolio of activities which can work collaboratively together to help the industry move forward. So I'd say that there's a kind of early and short-term opportunity for support to facilitate and coordinate that. In terms of the broader leasing rounds, given the scale of some of the investment we're talking about, particularly around infrastructure, and when you start talking about the energy system developing out to 2050 and the offshore transmission networks and the like, I think again, we've got this roadmap between now and 2050 and hitting at least 75 gigawatts. I think it would be really good to establish, a plan out to 2050 that provides long-term visibility around leasing activities, and that would put in place, I guess, a framework that some of these very significant investment decisions can be made against, both in the private sector but also in government. So yeah, that kind of longer term roadmap of regular leasing rounds with the kind of principles about how that might be managed would I think really provide a level of confidence that could really leverage a lot of the investment that we need.
Wow, thank you for that. Alan Rodri, sorry, while we wait for the poll results to come in, any further thoughts? What would you like to see from Crown Estate or Crown Estate Scotland next, and what's your thoughts about future auction rounds?
Yeah, if I jump in now, I think, as I mentioned before, I think we need to create that pipeline of projects. So I think leasing rounds are a key first step. Once we have the leases in place, it's the consents that will be a key focus to make sure we can get projects eligible for CFDs and ready to find a route to market by the end of 2030. This is also building a pipeline for growth beyond 2030. That's a really important thing to say, is that what we're doing now is this early deployment is going to be key to make sure that we have a technology which is cost competitive, and we can build supply chain in that time so that from 2030 onwards, we're able to deploy quite large volumes of offshore wind. I can see some of the poll results coming in. I think 20-30 gigawatts it seems to be the consensus, and I think that seems about right. If we're working back from 75 gigawatts, I think we're going to need large volumes of offshore wind to meet our net zero targets. And I think that 75 gigawatt in the question, really is at least 75 gigawatts, and there could be upside to that as well. So I think it's also worth considering not just the total, but also thinking about what is going to come from 2030 onwards. So if we can deploy 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, and the majority of that will be bottom fixed, we've got another maybe 40 to 60 gigawatts to deploy in the coming 20 years between 2030 and 2050. So is that additional 40 plus gigawatts that is got to be the focus. And you can't put that all off the East Coast, and you can't put it all in the Irish Sea. It's going to have to be dispersed around other parts of the UK.
Yeah.
Because of issues of cumulative impact, seabed, price cannibalization. I think there's a real role for floating to play, because when we do move outside of those areas, we do have to go into deeper waters. But that means we can access higher wind speeds, and there's a clear role for floating to play a pretty big role there.
Yeah, we can look at diversification. We can balance the system better. There's a whole range of reasons why it helps. So let's look at the poll results. So we've got more widespread view, but a majority in the middle. So 30% think we'll get up to 10 gigawatts, 41% up to 20 gigawatts, 33% of you think up to 30 gigawatts, and 12% of you beyond 30 gigawatts. So broadly, most people are, in the middle of that. People aren't thinking that floating is going to be the majority of offshore wind out by 2050, but it'll be playing a very significant role, at least a third of the UK delivery, let's say. So that's really interesting to see. I mean, and you mentioned the Irish Sea, Rodri. I mean, there's a lot happening in Ireland, of course, and the new minister, Eamon Ryan, is well known to us. The previous energy minister, he's been active in the energy sector between while he was outside of Parliament and government. He says, and the government says, they're looking at 30 gigawatts of floating offshore wind. And I was talking to David Connolly via Weir just this week about that, and he was highlighting how in Ireland they're starting and getting up to speed on fixed offshore wind, and now at the same time moving into floating. So there's a sort of a sense or question as to how much in Ireland you'll almost leapfrog some of the fixed sites and move to those deeper floating sites. But for the UK and Ireland, if you think of those as a shared market, as it were, that means a lot of activity. Let's say 60 gigawatts of floating offshore wind between those two territories. So a lot to do. Anyone? I don't know if anyone's been looking at the Irish market or looking at the Irish politics and the new Irish energy plans, but it would be, if anyone's got any comments, do let us know now. No? I'll not push you on Ireland then. Okay, good. Let's move on then. So thank you, the audience, for those polls. That's been really, really useful. So we're going to talk supply chain, but to help us, we want your views as the audience about markets. Where do you see the growth, particularly in the 2020s? So we've had your views about how much we'll get by 2030, and we talked in the panel about that. But where do you think that growth is going to be? That immediate projects. Where should, if I was coming into floating, if I was had a product or service I wanted to supply in, which market should I be looking for? So we only have 5 options. We tried not to give you too difficult and multiple choice. We've grouped some of these markets. So apologies for the simplicity of that, but hopefully it gives you a tenor of what's happening. So if I could get your views as the audience, do you think that the rapid growth we're going to see is in Norway, UK and Ireland, France, Portugal and Spain, so the southern Mediterranean, west coast of North America, or Southeast Asia? So give us your views, please. And while we do, we're going to move on. While you do that, we're going to move on to supply chain. Ralph, I'm going to come to you first on this. So the question is supply chain being a critical issue for industry. We're seeing industry being asked to submit supply chain development statements and planning for supply chain growth as part of the ScotWind leasing. But I'm doing work at the moment with Scottish Renewables on that and how the industry engages and what the best way to support supply chain growth and ambition is. But a question on that is, do you think it's realistic that we can get industry commitments so far in advance? And what do you think are the real UK Scottish opportunities for new employment and supply chain growth as we move into floating offshore wind?
Yeah, thanks for that, Matt. So, I mean, I think it's really important that we're having detailed discussions about supply chain development and supply chain engagement this early in project activities. So I'm very supportive of anything we can do to start those conversations this early. I think we need to realise that the development statements are an important part of that, but they're only part of what I would say we require, is an industrial strategy approach to this, both in Scotland but also in the UK. That's industrial strategy with a small I. But given the nature of the ambition to deliver the net zero target, but also the ambition to deliver increased levels of UK and Scottish content in projects, I think it's really important that those development plans are informing a broader and more involved dialogue between government and between industry about how we work together over the next 10 years to make sure that those projects can be delivered cost effectively, with a growing level of UK content. So they're important in starting that conversation. And and informing the thinking around that, but we can't expect those statements in themselves to deliver on the economic ambitions that we have for floating offshore wind, and this area is something that the Centre of Excellence is really, you know, looking to focus on in the next year or two, to make sure that the ambitions that we have in government around the level of UK content, you know, as wrapped up in the sector deal, you know, that we have a clear understanding about what each of the stakeholders requires to do to deliver on them. And I think we're at a stage now where we can map that out in a good level of detail. I think we can plan and we can make investment decisions to allow that to happen. But we do really need to get into that level of detail quite promptly. And I think this early kind of supply chain development planning process is a useful part of that.
Well, thanks. And Una, what's your views on the push for supply chain growth, and where do you see the particular opportunities?
Yes, I'd echo Ralph's comments there, particularly about giving visibility to the industry and governments in particular on where we make these right investments. I mean, investment with economic challenges at the minute, focused investments and making sure we get a return on our investments is going to be key going forward into the next decade. But I suppose as well, these supply chains are also giving us an opportunity to look at the workforce and looking at opportunities for diversification. I touched on and mentioned it a few times around diversification of oil and gas and shipbuilding. This is a great opportunity to see where they could potentially have an offering, and I suppose in particular have that business case for allowing cost reduction or realizing cost reduction within floating in particular. From a wider perspective, I mean, we've got a really good growth trajectory around fixed bottom at the minute, but equally floating comes in, and there is, I suppose, a perception that there might be a challenge around supply chain, and you know, we will put pressure on them. But there's elements here, fixed and floating are not competing, and there is diversification in what is required from a supply chain. So I think there are areas of overlap which we need to have focused attention on to ensure that we grow our workforce and skill base there, but equally then is working with other supply chain to ensure that we bring them on board and bring the lessons learned in and make sure that we have them adequately skilled and ready for the project delivery phases when they do land then. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, elements like Centre of Excellence, they are going to be key to collate all these challenges and ensure that we're focusing investment on the right areas. And I suppose making good on how we hit the next decade, but more importantly then is get that volume for 2040 and 2050.
Great, thanks, Una. Let's look at the poll results. So let's see, 40% think Norway is the place to focus, 35% say UK and Ireland, 11% France, Portugal and Spain, 10% West Coast North America, and 26% Southeast Asia. So they, you know, we're a UK centric audience, I assume, but UK comes out, followed by Southeast Asia, 26%, and after that Norway. I think that fits my knowledge of where the projects are coming now. So that's interesting to see that view. Let's see. Can I just come to you, Alan? Does that fit your view? Where do you see the markets for 2020? Does the audience think what you think?
I would say North Sea and Atlantic margins would be my first, but I think the other place I would consider, and I think will happen as well to some degree, is Southeast Asia. I think that will occur before West Coast of North America, just simply because that is a more challenging environment. You know, you don't go very far off the West Coast of North America before you drop down onto the ocean bottom, and the water depths are dramatically higher, deeper. So where you can stay on the continental shelf and you can stay within maybe 100 meters, 150 meters, you're in a much better opportunity, and you might be able to get down to 65 meters. Who knows? We'll see. But fundamentally, I think the bulk of the ones will be in that sort of water depth of 80, 90 meters up. And I also would think it's important to realize that there's not a competition between fixed and floating. It's an inevitable transition. And I come to that saying that because of what I saw as an oil man. You know, the first oil field in the UK was developed with floating technology. And it took us 20 years with playing around here and there to develop the technology. And then suddenly in the early 90s, one or two companies came up with an idea, FPSOs and various different things, and they progressed it forward. By the end of the 90s, you always asked why you weren't going to go floating unless you were in very shallow waters or you had a mega field. So I think that that's what's going to happen. And I suspect, I also agree with what Ralph said. I think what we need to accelerate the development are a series of projects earlier of a middle size of scale. We're not going to go straight to the gigawatts. We need to go to projects 200, 300, maybe even up to 500. I don't know the exact scale. It'll depend on location, developer, how you're going to fund it. But we need to be able to bring them forward in some way or other. And the country that can do that and get that established will be the country that owns a lot of the intellectual property around about how this industry works. And with those projects, you'll learn what the right ways and the wrong ways are. You create domestic jobs, and then you'll also create an international market in which your companies are the most prospective.
Great, Alan, thanks for that. And then Rodri, you work for a company active, headquarters in Norway, obviously, but active around the world. Where you talked at the beginning about some of your focus. Do you think that's right in terms of where we should focus effort and what the audience thinks about these priority markets?
I think so. Yeah, I think one thing in terms of the poll, I'd almost combine UK with Norway, treating it as a North Sea region. Based on results, you'd then be at 50%, which is again maybe highlights the
right
audience. So I'd agree with Aaron that Southeast Asia is also a big growth market. But just coming back to the North Sea, we've actually set ourselves up organisationally to capture synergies from a regional approach like this. So we now have a North Sea organisation which is looking to capture synergies between our assets in the UK and other North Sea markets. And floating wind really plays into that, given the opportunities we see in Norway and in Scotland. And you could expand that to Northern Europe as well if you consider Ireland's part of that. Then you have other clusters in Southern Europe, West Coast US, and again, East Asia is one where we see a lot of potential for growth. I think all the drivers are there: high energy demand, fairly limited onshore area for other renewable options, and the waters there get quite deep. So we think offshore wind is going to be really key to decarbonising those East Asian economies, and we think that the threshold between fixed and floating will come quicker. And as Alan mentioned, it isn't a question of fixed or floating, it's about just deploying offshore wind. And we need all the tools in our armoury to get to net zero, and floating is just going to be a really important tool in helping us get there in these different regions. And I think linking that then to supply chains to say that it's going to take a regional approach. Those, the synergies I mentioned that we're trying to capture, most of those are related to supply chain. So we're not going to be able to do it all ourselves, but we're hoping that each country will play an important role. Each of these big markets, if they have a strong domestic market, will inevitably capture a lot of benefit. And it's about focusing on strengths and finding where UK suppliers can be competitive in a global market, and then tap into that export potential. So that's the key thing to do. So I think the early engagement that's happening is really good to see. And we're looking forward to working with our suppliers and developing domestic supply chains in each of the markets that we're working in.
Great, thanks, Rodri. So we've got a couple more questions. Your questions are coming in. I'm seeing them on the screen on my sidebar. So thank you for that. Keep them coming. I'll do my best to group and get them back out to you, the rest of the panel. We've got some questions coming in on grid. So we already had a question scheduled. So let me try and put those together. So grid is obviously a critical issue for anyone in offshore wind. And there are different connection challenges for floating compared to fixed sites. Sites could be further from shore. Some of the sites we'll be looking at, obviously, through the ScotWind will be in higher transmission zones. So I'd like to hear the panel's views about what concerns they have on grid and connection issues, and how they'd like to change how we approach connection going forward. So Una, if I could come to you first on that.
Yeah, I mean, there has been a lot of challenges around grid, and they will probably continue to be over the next decade. But I mean, ensuring that we don't leave this being a barrier to the development, I think, is going to be key. And we need to ensure that we keep the momentum on reviews and make sure that our project pipeline around things like domestic HVDC links and interconnectors between countries as well is given full support. Particularly, I suppose we are seeing challenges with one HVDC link at the minute. I mean, it's imperative we get this right, and we have a number of upcoming HVDC links that we've got in either development or in early construction. We need to make sure that we keep the momentum on this, because they will jeopardize, if we don't get these in place, they will potentially jeopardize what we're hoping to achieve with these leases, particularly in Scotland. I mean, around the charging side, I mean, there has been a number of reviews around the charging regime. This is going to be important to make sure that there's a balance across the UK in particular. We have seen some distortion around some of the investment decisions there, so we need to make sure that we have the balance when we're looking at both the Round 4 and the ScotWind opportunities, and that we have a balanced approach to that, and making sure that we can give them the best chance they have to success. So yes, a lot to be done. It's an area where we certainly cannot afford to take our eye off the ball, particularly, I suppose, on the west coast with some challenges up the north of Scotland in remote areas. We need to make sure that we are ready for these projects to come on shore, particularly a number of these being pivotal to the industry.
Great, Una, thanks for that. And Ralph, for your companies, in terms of the Centre of Excellence, how much is grid something that they're asking you to help them coordinate and fix?
Yes, I mean, I would say grid is an issue that offshore wind has had to deal with, particularly in Scotland, for a long period of time. It's certainly, when we look at ScotWind, there's there are grid challenges there, but I would see those challenges as an extension of the existing challenges we have in offshore wind more generally. I think, and so we are already we've already delivered a piece of work looking at grid, particularly in Scotland, for the partners. But I think in terms of terminology and thinking and approaches, to me, the term grid is something that is used less and less in dialogue now, and it's much more of a discussion around a broader, more complex energy system of which the grid is part. And one of the early projects that we're delivering in the Centre of Excellence at the moment is looking at floating offshore wind's role in that future energy system. And that's considering, yes, connecting into the electrical grid, as is at the moment, but also the role of hydrogen, off-grid electrical resource and demand. So I think the discussions we're having around grid need to be subsumed into a broader dialogue and kind of policy making infrastructure, which is at the energy system level, not at the grid level. Because if you look here in Scotland and also around the UK, by 2050, our energy system is going to look very different. We've done the easy bit, and in plugging in wind farms to the existing grid. The next phase is much more complex, and so I think in terms of developments, I think just broadening the terminology and our ambitions to consider that whole energy system, and then establishing policy and decision making forums in the UK that can take a view on how the energy system is most likely and most cost effectively going to develop, and then making the infrastructure decisions to allow that to happen. I think that's really what we need to move to relatively quickly. And I guess my view would be that we have, as much as we could hope for in terms of ability to understand how the energy system might develop, what the costs are, what the technologies are. So I think we have everything we need at the moment, at least, to put that plan in place and get cracking with it. So, but it is at that energy system level rather than just focusing on the grid.
Great, thanks, Ralph. There's a lot in hydrogen. I can see questions coming on hydrogen, so we'll come back to that for sure. But that system level makes a lot of sense, and it's interesting to think about how people will respond to ScotWind and looking at, say, direct connection, just connection to land, use of hydrogen, there could be a lot of creativity there in terms of people trying to get around costs and barriers to get projects developed. And I've looked at, and I'd like to learn more about the different approaches. But for example, there's the recent German auction process, which was explicit about leasing of sites without connection. So asking people to look at hydrogen and potential other options instead of assuming they'd be connected back into the German transmission system. Here we're expecting and asking developers to look at that, and let's see what comes through over the next few months. So final question from me before we throw it open. It's cropped up before, but I'm interested in energy transition, and particularly about how we help industries transition. And that's an issue in Scotland, around Aberdeen and oil and gas expertise there, and also in South Wales around Milford Haven, which is a significant importer of an expertise in the gas sector. So we've got these industries, they're looking at transition. We know that some of those companies are looking seriously at floating offshore wind. The discussion on hydrogen, using turbines to power existing platforms, say like Equinor, you're doing it with Tampen, Rodri. And even I've seen from OGA and others, ideas about how you could repurpose oil and gas platforms to be floating offshore wind hubs. So lots of thinking in this area, but how realistic is this energy transition? How easy is it going to be for these firms to become renewable companies, and how smooth is it going to be in practice? And Rodri, you're working in there, you see a company that's trying to do both. Is this energy transition going to work, do you think?
It's going to have to work. I think, but yeah, we're certainly in the midst of an energy transition. And as a company, we're obviously in the thick of that transition now. Then I've talked a lot about the clean electrons in growing our renewable business, where offshore wind is a real pillar. But we're also looking at clean molecules as well. On the one hand, decarbonising our oil and gas production, but also we're doing a lot of work on hydrogen and CCS. We've got some fairly large-scale projects that we're developing, including a CCS project called Northern Lights, which we're capturing CO2 and putting that under the North Sea. We also have recently announced plans for a very large hydrogen project on the Humber in the UK, which will be a blue hydrogen facility. And of course, we have projects like Hyrum and Tampen, which are both helping to develop floating offshore wind and decarbonising the oil and gas side. So we're transitioning ourselves as a company to becoming a broader energy company and trying to capture value from the opportunities that come from a low carbon energy future. And I think energy transition is going to be an important part of the story and the value proposition for floating wind as well, particularly on a supply chain level. When we talk about companies diversifying from oil and gas, the fossil-based energy towards renewables, I think there are a lot of synergies there with floating that can be captured. And there's a need for a lot of collaboration and understanding between developers and suppliers to understand what the needs are, what the differences and the challenges will be. In terms of specific applications of floating, I mentioned the oil and gas electrification, and Hyrum Tampen is going to prove that is technically viable, and that is something we think could open new value streams for floating offshore wind, new applications for it. But it's at the same time we can't underestimate some of the challenges of this, and I think we are looking for other opportunities beyond Tampen to do similar work. But the business cases are, as of today, fairly challenging. So there is going to be a need for public support to get these projects over the line, whether that's through carbon pricing, taxation, or other incentive mechanisms to make them viable. But it's something that's, with the right support in place, could play an important role in both supporting a new energy technology and decarbonising the offshore oil and gas production that is still essential for the energy system. When it comes to hydrogen, I mentioned a blue hydrogen project we're involved in, and we see a lot of potential to move to scale quite quickly through blue hydrogen. But green hydrogen, of course, has an important role as well. In terms of realistic, I think it's certainly realistic in the future, but as of today, again, the business cases are a little challenging because of where we are in terms of cost and pricing. But we've seen quite rapid cost reduction in other renewable technologies, and if hydrogen can follow the same path, then it could be competitive. But it's something I'd maybe don't necessarily see a huge amount in terms of scale in the next decade, but could be scalable beyond 2030. So a combination of both blue and green will be of course important for that. So so realistic in time, I'd say yes, but it will take time and will take a collaboration across different industries to get there.
Thanks, Rodri, and thanks for the insights from inside Equinor, who's managing and grappling with that transition. And Alan, you described yourself earlier as an ex-oil man. I mean, obviously you helped Talisman build the Beatrice demonstrator, got them interested in offshore wind, and you subsequently you've become an offshore wind man, I guess we could say. So how have you experienced the transition, and what do you see as the big issues for the oil and gas sector?
Well, I'll address that in a minute, but first of all, I'm very keen to just state something about the grid. I mean, I think the grid problem is that we have a system which is basically embedded in a world that's massively out of date. And the problem is you have a lot of people with an interest in that system, and trying to change it is difficult. I think something has to be done to change it. The question is how and when, and how do you deal with the winners and the losers within that? It's very difficult. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's something that has to be changed. Coming on to the energy transition, I think the energy transition is a very important opportunity for offshore wind, and it's something that we're looking at carefully to see if we can find a way of bringing the two, the historic offshore business of oil and gas, together with wind in a way which is mutually beneficial. Can we create, in the ideal world, a place where the oil companies win, the wind companies win, and the government wins? It may be possible, but it is challenging. And the other big challenge, and probably the biggest one, is time. It just takes a long, long time to do things in the wind business, and that doesn't match or marry with the opportunity set in the oil and gas sector in the North Sea. Can we bring those two things together? I don't know, but I do think there's opportunities. In regard to hydrogen, there's lots of people saying, yep, we're all for hydrogen. I'm starting to become a believer in it. I don't know a lot about it. But colleagues of mine from various different sectors have been convinced, and they're gradually convincing me. I'm a little bit cynical about the oil companies' desire for it, because I'm not quite sure what there seems to be a lot of it driven by to reuse pipelines to send hydrogen down it. And I'm not quite sure that is really doable. It's very difficult. You get hydrogen cracking and various impacts on the pipelines, I believe. Or you're forced to do is a mixture of carbon methane, ethane, and hydrogen. And I'm not sure if that's a route that we want to progress down in the near term. I don't know about it, but I do think that it is something which a number of people I'm aware of are working on it, and maybe there are solutions out there which mean it is a plausible way forward. But hydrogen seems to be something that will have a big future.
Thank you, Alan. And we've got lots of discussion coming in on the questions, and lots of comments as well on hydrogen. There's lots of different views. I'm seeing people seeing it as a main event, or wondering if it's just a distraction. Let's move on now. Thank you to you all so far. Now we're going to open it up to the questions. Panelists and myself, we're seeing the questions come in on our sidebar, and I'm going to try my best to try and get them and find the right ones from you all. So first, someone's asked about ports, and port infrastructure is a big issue. And I've seen in my work, looking at, for example, the Swansea City deal bid has finally come through, and that will allow investment in Milford Haven, which is looking at the Celtic Seas. But what are the infrastructure challenges for ports, and what port capability are we going to need to see to support this growth in floating offshore wind? Una, can I come to you on that one first, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a real opportunity in particular to bring in local content around the ports, port side, particularly around assembly, whether there is on-site fabrication or it's coming in from overseas. There is a lot to be had, particularly around floating wind when it comes to the ports. I mean, the challenges is understanding, I suppose, the scale of the substructures and understanding what capacities these ports need and how they load out and how they maneuver the substructures and the, I suppose, the assembly points around the yards. That's going to be a challenge, making sure that they have the right craneage for the installation of the turbines, and I suppose getting that serial fabrication in, system, the methodology in place to ensure that we've got guaranteed loadouts, so we can tow them to site. So there's some of the highlights, but I suppose the challenge for the ports and harbours is making sure that we have industry talking about this from an early stage so they can make decisions around investments. A number of facilities have popped up their head and are really keen on getting involved in this industry, but maybe some of the facilities may not have the full capacity to deliver some of the commercial scale projects. So looking at partnering at this stage might be a really important aspect.
Great, thanks, Ian. Anyone else from the panel like to comment?
Yeah, I'd comment on that. I mean, I think one of the big important things in ports is, I mean, let's not go and look at every port in the country. We need to start back, and the starting point, in my view, is the design of the substructure. And how are we going to have one which works in a variety of ports, so there's some degree of competition? And then the other one is, what are we actually going to do in those ports? One of the things is it's a long, slow process building the current designs. The future designs, to my mind, have to be modularized. And the activity is not about building all the bits from first principles, like laying down the hull, but putting those bits together as quickly as possible and doing 4 things. Assemble those modules, launch the machine, put the tower turbine and blades on, don't matter which order you do those 2 things, and then commission it. And I would like to see it leaving port with the aspiration that we always had when we built oil platforms, that it's a bit difficult there, but in this situation where we've connected it to the grid, everything upstream of the high voltage connection is fully commissioned. We tow it out to port, and we need a series of ports which are within a sensible towing distance to flight. We get out to site, we pick up the moorings, we pick up the cables, and we're ready to go. But I understand that's a very theoretical, a very simplistic view. But the closer that the supply chain and the ports can get to delivering something like that, the better it will be. And most importantly, it creates a real reason for the localization of jobs. You're taking offshore jobs and moving them onshore. You're taking activities which would be done in shifts and people working away from home and letting them go home every night. All of that is the way forward. I personally believe in 3 or 4 ports around the country which are within sensible towing distance for all of the areas that we need to go. And that creates a huge, and that skill, once you've got it, is also an exportable skill from those ports and organizations that have been involved in it, because we're not going towing these things to China or to Japan or North America, but what we will be doing is taking the expertise about how to do it. And I think that's the future. We build our industry here, we deliver our domestic market, and we do what we've done in this offshore oil and gas, particularly the subsea sector, where the UK is the world leader.
Yeah, absolutely.
Alan, thanks. So we've got a question coming. Let's very close to that. Someone's asking about, bearing in mind the opportunities for greater onshore fabrication and integration of turbines and superstructures. You've just been talking through that, Alan. Do we expect to see a change in contractual arrangements to help deliver that? Any thoughts on how these contracts and the relationship with the supply chain, particularly say the EPCIs or those tier 1s, could change to help support that different way of building and delivering floating offshore wind? No, I thought it was a good question. Alan, back to you.
I think it's a good question, but I'm not sure that I'm the most capable person to answer that. Within our organization, Nicol is a lawyer and a former government minister and things. And that's an area where I usually slope my shoulders and say, hey, Nicol, you want to give some comments on that? So I can see what the idea is, and how you exactly bring that around, I don't know. I mean, that's for the industry and actually an individual developer with individual contractors to determine what the best way forward is, and also to see whether there's something government can do to make those opportunities. I don't think that there's going to be a massive number of them because there's only so many of these ports you need, but you do want competition in it to try to get it done most efficiently and most effectively. And when you go around the coast of the UK, and I think I've been to most of them over the last year, there aren't exactly that many places on the North Sea coast you can actually go. So I think you just have to see how we need the design to work in those places, and then we need to work out how we're going to create the work and undertake it there and create the opportunity for the jobs and for the contractors to build on.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Alan.
So
Audrey.
on contractual arrangements and structures, but just a more general comment on supply chain. I think it's important to realise the most important thing here is that we get ScotWind or other UK floating projects and Scottish projects over the line, and they are competitive and successful in CFD auctions. That is the most important thing, is that we can build a strong domestic market, and from that we can export. First is bring projects, and then we want to, of course, maximise the amount we can do locally. But we need to focus on where there are strengths, and it's already been mentioned that there are a lot of learnings that can come from oil and gas, particularly on the subsea side. There's a huge amount of job potential from O&M and the ports as well. I would agree it's also an area where that will be more localised, and I see the ports in Scotland are already fairly well equipped and are making strong efforts and putting plans in place to be ready for the ScotWind projects when they are ready in 5-10 years' time. So I think there's going to be a lot of potential there, but I also think that we shouldn't get too hung up on doing everything, and we need to focus on where we can capture the most value, both at home and then by exporting it.
I would agree with that, Roderick. I think the key thing is what is our anchor upon which we can create those opportunities. And, I accept there's opportunities in Scotland round about the ports and the Cromarty and going up to Shetland, maybe even Orkney. But let's not forget, there's also areas of Northeast England. If we have the right designs, they have another asset, and that asset is a larger population with a skills base which can be applied. And, I expect that the assembly is a key thing. It gives us a drag. Where the bits are made, that's a secondary question. It goes to the global market, but it may be that there's a company just down the road which is quite capable and competent of doing it and can do it at a price that makes sense. So I think it's about getting, as you say, getting the projects running in a few locations and making these things happen, but coming back to the design to make sure the facilities we have are able to compete in those markets.
Mm-hmm. And just one last point. I suppose the early projects, not full, maybe commercial scale up to the 500 megawatt limit, but like the early stepping stone projects like the Tampan, how important they are for the shipbuilding industry, just to get that early initial exposure on the projects. I mean, we need a few of them to get our supply chain enthused around how best they can do it, and trial it then for the big commercial scale deliveries as such.
Yeah, let me just add on that. I think totally right. Tampan is going to be an important role for the supply chain, particularly in Norway, because it's based in Norway. But at the same time, I think there is a balance to be struck between a project which is big enough for suppliers to enter, but also is big enough to create the appetite for investment. Yeah. Which is why I think we see a need for larger scale projects, because it will take a certain volume to trigger those investments that are needed. And those are investments that will come from the private sector, also from public as well. And another part, I guess, on supply chain more broadly is that this isn't going to be left with individuals here and there to pick up on their own. It's going to take a really collaborative effort across industry. That's from developers, government, suppliers, all working together to then understand where those investments can and should best be placed and can maximise value. And I think again, it's having a large pipeline of projects and that visibility which allows the supply chain to invest and gives the public sector confidence that their investments are going to be well spent. So I think let's first focus on creating a market, and then we can really drive supply chain to deliver those. But obviously, the early engagement that we're hoping to see now is going to be a key part of that.
Good. Okay. Thank you for that. And let's look at costs now. So we have a question, Ralph, for you. Question has asked, what are the most difficult cost elements in floating offshore wind that need more effort or innovation to reduce cost? And they're asking that particularly in relation to the ScotWind leasing.
Yeah, I think I think from a technical perspective, there are certainly challenges, but I think they're relatively well understood, and I think with the activity that we see already ongoing in the various programs, across the industry, I think we're well placed to tackle them. I would say the biggest challenges that we have around cost are probably non-technical. Scale is the obvious one. Investor confidence, cost of capital, the ability of ourselves to demonstrate that we can plan and execute projects as per plan. So I think the most challenging parts of cost reduction are linked to to scale and ensuring that we can support that for the next 10 or 20 years. And it's not just about going from where we are now to as big as possible as quickly. I mean, government knows that there is a requirement to support the industry. What we need to do is demonstrate that we can understand what will drive cost reduction and deliver a portfolio of increasingly large projects which track, broadly against that, and we can build up as an industry a track record of delivering on cost reduction as we did in fixed bottom, and I think doing that over the next 10 or 15 years is what we need to focus on. So it's not just about going to scale quickly, it's about growing scale and being able to almost forecast and then deliver on that cost reduction. So that's clearly a big one. And in terms of the other major area that we see it's not necessarily a technical one, but it's about the approach to delivery of the project. So this approach to fabrication of substructures in this kind of modular fashion, and then a very efficient and well-run process where they go in the water, they are commissioned, they are taken out to site, they are plugged in a timely fashion, and not just that happens quickly, that we develop confidence around our ability to plan and then execute that. And so yeah, I think they're probably the two main areas. It's the scale area and the ability to plan and execute the kind of the delivery elements of projects where I think we not that we have the most challenges, but I think that's where that's where our real focus, particularly for ScotWind, needs to be, particularly when you start reflecting on the desire to see Scottish organisations or UK organisations having a role in those.
Good. Anyone else on the panel want to add anything on that?
I suppose just from the technical perspective, I mean, the turbines are going to be pivotal on this. I mean, we're looking at even bigger turbines that we have commercially available. That is, and has been, one of the biggest game changers in the cost reduction for fixed bottom, and it will continue to be within floating. Standardisation and serial fabrication, I think, has a huge role to play within the cost reduction side. I'm hoping cost of finance will probably stay steady. It was one of the pivotal points again in fixed bottom, and hopefully it will continue to be for floating. And mooring design, I think there's a lot we can do there to reduce the cost when it comes to the mooring designs. A lot of good work going in from, say, the Carbon Trust and wider JIPs, but I think that can add a lot of value to us. But let's not forget as well the O&M side. There's a number of deep dives going. I mean, we're looking at it from the Offshore Innovation Hub there as well, from whether we bring the systems back to port for servicing or for major component changeouts, or we do we've longer periods of O&M. And I think that's going to be a key area as well for the cost. We need to look at it from a full life cycle perspective. So it is going to be a pivotal area as well.
But Una, on that, we've got a question from someone who was involved in deploying initial demo units, and their worry is that there's not much appetite or financial capability for trialing and experimenting with new technology. So we seem to have, we're sort of caught. On the one hand, we do need to rationalize and and commercialize the scale up around a few designs, but on the other, there are new designs and new ideas coming into the market. So how do we best create some space so we can finance and develop and innovate at the same time as commercializing?
Yeah, I mean, the market at the minute is very buoyant. I mean, there was a Bloomberg report that came out. I don't have the exact figures on that one at hand, but it was quite impressive on where the investment appetite and on what they have secured, particularly over the COVID crisis. And I would hope that that continues. We've seen a project in the Southwest which had a major oil and gas entry there, and that was a demonstration. You know, it was sub 100 megawatts. You're seeing points of entry for some of the wider supply chain or wider developer appetite as well. So I think there is an element of a place for the early, smaller scale projects at the minute, but we do need to move towards the 200, 300 megawatts very quickly to ensure that we are pushing ahead with commercialization.
Okay, thanks.
Can I make a comment there, Matt?
Of course, yes.
I think, you know, I can see this comment that's come in about the costs on demonstrators are very difficult to make money in. Okay, you get a lot of money. It seems like we're getting a big incentive. Okay, in order to do it, but there are an awful lot of people out there who figure they're entitled to a rent on it. Okay, and the bigger you are, the more rent you can choose. And they don't see it as a rent. I'm speaking as a developer. They see it as part of the cost of doing a small project and all the overhead that they have to deal with. So it becomes very challenging. And I actually think that the demonstrators, whether it's Highwind or Kincardine, are about showing this can be done. Okay. And then as you move to bigger projects, there has to be a discussion with the supply chain about, yeah, we can do something different and we'll take the risk on it, but we'll only do so many on any one project, and you have to give us the confidence and help us manage that risk, because the developer hasn't got a blank check. But equally, we do want to move forward. And on each project, you get a change of technologies and a series of benefits, and that fixes the cost, and it's then about delivering that project. Then the next time round, you come to a new project, you have new experience and you have new technologies, but you don't apply everyone in every project. You try to work your way along, you find out what worked, what didn't work, and you try to get that gain moved into the future projects. And I think one of the things the wind industry has done is actually quite remarkable of the way it's actually managed to achieve that in fixed bottom structures in a relatively short period of time. You know, since the advent of round 3 in a decade, we've made major cost transformation. So I think that's what has to happen. We need bigger projects, few changes, but those things lead to the next project and it all brings the cost down. The question is, how many projects do we need? It's not just about megawatts, it's also about projects, because you lock in the story on each one and the next one gains the benefits.
Oh, thank you.
Just
Audrey.
So that innovation never stops. As Alan said, we take learnings from project to project. We've been doing that from our first demo to Highwind Scotland to Tampen, and we'll do that beyond. But innovation never stops, and it shouldn't be a barrier to scaling up. Yeah. I think in large-scale projects, bringing innovation, we've done that in bottom-fixed offshore wind, we've done it in oil and gas. It'll be the same here. So it shouldn't be anything that holds us back. Yeah. And I think from our perspective on cost, the big driver is scale, and it's about how we can mass produce the components and infrastructure. The technology is there. We're confident the technology already exists. It's a case of finding ways to deploy this at scale. And we've been doing a lot of work on that, particularly on the substructure, looking at ways we can mass produce floating foundations and ideally do as much as possible locally. And for us means as well as much as looking at Highwind spars, looking at alternative substructures. We've been doing a lot of work, particularly on semi-submersibles, and understanding what it will take to mass produce these cost effectively at scale. And that's something we're looking to bring to our future projects after Tampen.
Audrey, thank you. So let's have a change of tack. We've got a question come in about future careers. Someone says, I'm a soon to graduate applied energy economics MSc student. Considering the job market and intense competition, what advice do you have for someone looking to join the industry? So, for you, the four of you looking back on your career, thinking forwards, what advice do you have for someone, particularly in someone who's interested in the floating offshore wind market? What should they do? Who wants to go first?
I'll go. I think it's a really fantastic time to be entering the market. I mean, especially from, I think it was economics who said the individual was studying. Looking at, say, the supply chain market in Scotland at the minute and understanding that supply chain plan, which is going into the Crown Estate Scotland. I mean, who better than to be able to give us some indication on what kind of, where the GVA, where the impacts are going to be is our budding economists. I think we don't use enough of that type of skill set, and I think it's going to be imperative going forward to make sure we have a full balance and a full view of the financial models that are going into the energy system, not just offshore wind. We're probably going to see a lot more hybrid models coming into these development projects, and reaping local benefit, making sure that we're, as developers, we're in a better position to understand how we're influencing the market, how we're supporting our supply chain. It's going to be key. But I think it's a very good point of entry coming in. I know it's tough times at the minute, seeing a pathway into a new role, but certainly I would keep positive. I think there's a lot to offer.
Great. Who's next?
Well, I've got the greyest hair here, I guess.
Go on, Al.
Do what you want to do and take the opportunities. I joined the oil business because when I didn't know about carbon in those days, but when I left university, the new industry on the block was oil and gas, okay? And I wanted to play in that game. I wanted to jump on and off helicopters. I thought that would be really exciting. As I got there, I realized there's lots of things you learn. You get into a company and you then follow the opportunity set. I didn't intend to leave the oil business and move into the wind business. I did it by accident. I followed the opportunity, and I think I really have enjoyed doing it. So I think my message to you is find the job that gets you into the system that you're interested in, and then follow the opportunities that provides you, and be enthusiastic and determined. And that would be my advice.
Yeah, definitely.
Rodri, well, if you're slightly more, a few years ahead of you, perhaps.
You can jump on and off helicopters too if you want.
Yeah, I mean, for a couple of years, I've worked in renewables since I graduated. I'm a mechanical engineer by qualification, and I've loved it. It's been, I think some of us who've been involved either completely or for most of our careers take for granted a lot of the innovation and the growth and the development that just surrounds us in the industry. And I think when you look at other sectors, you realize that we've been extremely fortunate in this industry to be part of what's really quite an incredible story. So I mean, I would very actively encourage anybody to join us, and I would also suggest that hitting 75 gigawatts at least by 2050 is going to require a huge amount of talent and skill and experience. So the workforce inside the industry, in all parts of the industry, is going to have to scale rapidly as well. And so, yeah, if we can attract the brightest and best and most passionate in the industry, I appreciate the short term is challenging. I would just encourage you to stay engaged, and I would be comfortable that an opportunity will come your way in due course, and would encourage you to jump on the opportunity when it does come.
Rodri, final thoughts for you.
Yeah, totally agree with what's been said. I think likewise, I more fell into offshore wind than pursued it, and I've really thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think linked to what Ralph said, I think offshore wind is going to be a cornerstone of the UK energy sector and our economy going forward. So I think it's going to play a really big role, and I think by the time our hair's as grey as Alan's, we'll be able to look back with some pride, and hopefully seeing 75 gigs of offshore wind installed, and a good chunk of that being floating.
Thank you all. And my perspective, my career started when I was in Barrow and Furness, and I was working on primarily energy efficiency. And offshore wind started to get talked about. This was pre-round one. That was 20 plus years ago. And look now, we've delivered 10 gigawatts here in the UK approx. Yet, you know, we were talking here as a panel and the questions with the audience about, well, how far, how close, how soon will we get to 75 gigawatts? So there's so much to play for, and there's so much opportunity in this industry. And I guess, Alan, linking back to what you were saying, it must, if you're looking at renewables now, it must feel like if you were looking at, say, oil and gas when that boom was going on. There's lots of opportunity. So yeah, just follow your expertise and keep yourself keen. And on that note, it's time to wind up. This has gone really quickly, at least for me. Thank you for the panel. Thank you for you as an audience for asking the great questions and giving us your views for the polls. We've covered a lot of ground. There's more to do, of course. I said at the start that, you know, with All Energy not able to physically take place, it was great to be able to take part in these webinars. And there's more to come. We did our first offshore wind webinar in May, and we asked you as part of that what next, and floating wind was something you said, can we talk about that? So we've done that. You asked about hydrogen, so keep your eyes open. We'll be coming back and looking at that as a topic and other things. Your inbox will be buzzing, I'm sure, no doubt, with All Energy updating you on future plans. But tomorrow, there are 2 other webinars taking place. In the morning, there's a webinar, Keeping It Real. It's an inclusive transition to net zero. That's looking at how no one gets left behind on the road to recovery, how we deal with the impacts of COVID-19 and what the path to a net zero future looks like. So there's lots there to listen in and get involved in. And then in the afternoon, there's a discussion on solar. Some of my close friends from the Solar Trade Association, others are in that webinar, and they're looking at 40 gigawatts of solar deployment by 2030. So they've got a lot of ambition too. So again, there's full information on the All Energy site. Have a look at that. Thank you for taking part, and I hope to see you all soon physically as well as virtually. I'm very excited because this afternoon I go and get my hair cut. So this is the last you will all see of my COVID hair. But there's lots of still work to do for us all. So thank you again. See you all soon.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.